ever wondered what it really means to be cowboy tough? We often picture the myth, a lone rider, silhouetted against a crimson sunset, his face weathered and knowing. We see him easily rolling into a single simple blanket by a small, crackling fire, the stars bright above him. It is a romantic image, one of endless freedom and quiet competence. It is an image that has defined a nation, but it is, almost entirely, a fantasy. Tonight, we are joining a real trail crew, not in the warm glow of a Hollywood sunset, but on the vast, unforgiving plains of late-season Texas. The air is mild, deceptive, but it is about to turn against them in a way few of us can truly imagine. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we pull back the frozen canvas tarp on the Hollywood myth to feel the chilling, visceral reality of a cowboy's winter. It is a real pleasure to have you here with us on this journey into the past. If you find comfort in our travels and enjoy these stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It is a simple, quiet way to support our work, and it truly helps our community grow, allowing us to build this space for relaxation and history together. And as always, I am curious to know where you are settling in from tonight. What time is it in your part of the world? Please let me know in the comments. It is a wonderful thing to see how far these stories travel. For now, find your comfortable spot. Let the sounds of your own world begin to fade away. Settle in, breathe deeply, and get ready for our story. This is the last good day, and the men, though they do not know it, are about to be tested to the very limits of their endurance. We are on the Chisholm Trail. The year is sometime in the 1870s, in the heart of the great post-Civil War cattle boom. This was the era, roughly from 1866 to 1886, that forged the very profession of the cowboy. The vast, hungry markets in the North and East wanted beef, and Texas had millions of wild, hardy longhorns. The trails, like the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving, were the new arteries of a nation, pumping wealth and livestock from the southern plains to the railheads in Kansas. Our crew is weary. They have been on the trail for weeks, pushing a herd of nearly 3,000 longhorns. The day-to-day life is a grind of dust and monotony. Their day began, as it always does, before the first light of dawn, around 3:30 a.m. The cookie, had the fire going and the coffee on his call of grub, rousing the men from their bedrolls. Now, in the late afternoon, the sun feels deceptively mild on the backs of their necks. It is a welcome, gentle warmth, a rare kindness in this late season. The air is thick with the smells of the drive. The primary scent is dust, a fine alkaline powder kicked up by 12,000 hooves, a cloud that follows them for miles. Beneath that is the grassy, sweet smell of the dry prairie, and the sharp, ever-present animal smell of the cattle and the horses. And of course, the smell of men who have not truly bathed in a month. The soundtrack of their lives is the constant, low shuffling and clicking of hooves, a sound like a river of stone. It is punctuated by the occasional lowing of the herd and the rhythmic, familiar creak of saddle leather. This crew is a perfect cross-section of the era. The trail boss, riding a little ways off from the herd, is a former Confederate soldier, his eyes still holding the haunt of distant battles. He is the undisputed authority. His pay, around $100 a month, makes him a wealthy man out here. His word is law. The point riders, guiding the front of the herd, include a seasoned vaquero from south of the border. His ancestors were the first cowboys, and he understands the mind of a longhorn better than any man alive. He is an artist on horseback. The flank and swing riders, managing the sides of the massive herd, are a mix of young men seeking adventure and hard-bitten veterans who know no other life. And then, at the very back, come the drag riders. This is the worst job on the trail. They ride in the thickest part of the dust cloud, their teeth grinding on grit, their bandanas pulled up over their noses. They are often the newest members of the crew, and on this drive, 2 of them are newly freed black men, for whom this grueling, dangerous work, paying perhaps $30 a month, is still a form of freedom and independence. Their mobile headquarters is the chuck wagon, that ingenious invention of Charles Goodnight. It is the crew's kitchen, their pantry, their hospital, and their bank. The cookie who runs it is often second in command. A grizzled veteran who might be too old to ride all day, but is tough enough to manage the supplies, cook 3 hot meals, and defend his territory with a branding iron. This is a late-season drive. They are pushing their luck. The grass is thinner now, the water holes farther apart. The cattle themselves, the famous longhorns, are not the placid cows of a modern farm. They are prized for their incredible hardiness, their ability to survive on sparse land, but they are half-wild, nervous, and quick to anger or panic. Their horns, spanning 6 feet or more, are deadly. The trail boss reins in his horse. He is a man paid to be wary. He has led crews for a decade, and he knows this land. The endless, flat horizon is unbroken in every direction. A sea of grass under a pale blue sky, but something is wrong. The mildness of the air feels false, hollow. He tastes the air, a habit he cannot explain. He turns in his saddle, looking to the north, and he sees it. At first, it is nothing, just a smudge, a slightly darker line on the vast, empty horizon. He squints. It is not a cloud, not a normal one. It is a wall, a low, dark, blue-black mass that seems to be swallowing the sky as it moves toward them. He has seen this before, but it never fails to make his blood run cold. He lifts his hand, a signal to the riders nearest him. He does not shout, not yet. The air, which had been still, suddenly goes utterly silent. The wind dies completely. It is a heavy, breathless pause, as if the world is holding its breath. This is the calm before the storm, a real and terrifying phenomenon. As the warm southern air is violently sucked toward the approaching cold mass, the cattle feel it first. The endless shuffling of hooves stops. 3,000 animals lift their heads as one, sniffing the air. A low, anxious sound begins to rumble through the herd, a vibration felt in the chest. They become agitated, restless, their horns clacking together as they begin to mill in place. They can sense the catastrophic drop in air pressure. They know what is coming. The trail boss does not need to look at a thermometer. He does not have one. He reads the signs. The dark line on the horizon is no longer a line. It is a towering, churning wall of deep, bruised blue, racing toward them faster than any horse could run. The air takes on a sharp, metallic smell, the smell of ozone, the smell of ice, and then it hits. It is not a breeze, it is a physical blow. A solid wall of wind, roaring out of the north, strikes them with the force of a freight train. The sound is deafening, a screaming freight train roar that instantly drowns out all other sound. The wind shifts instantly from a gentle southern touch to a 60-mile-per-hour northern blast, and the temperature, it is the most shocking part. The mild, late autumn day vanishes in a single second. The temperature plummets 10 degrees, 20, 30. Within 5 minutes, it has dropped 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The sweat on the men's necks and backs turns instantly to ice. Exposed skin feels like it is being burned. This is the Blue Norther, a weather event infamous and feared in the Texas Panhandle. The first precipitation is not snow. It is sleet, tiny, hard pellets of ice that strike the men's faces like needles. Then it turns to grapple, a soft, stinging hail. The sky is gone. The world is reduced to a roaring, freezing, horizontal chaos. The herd, terrified, bellows. This is the moment of greatest danger. This is what the trail boss fears most. The cattle, blinded by the storm and driven by pure panic, are on the verge of a stampede. If they run, they will scatter for 100 miles. They will be lost. The men who try to stop them will be frozen, or worse, trampled in the dark. The trail boss cups his hands to his mouth, his face already caked in ice. He screams against the wind, his voice torn away, but the riders nearest him see his signal. His orders are simple, desperate: find shelter, make camp. Now, the gentle cattle drive is over. The frantic race for survival has begun. There is no time for discussion. This is a practiced, desperate chaos. The crew's training takes over. The trail boss screams orders, pointing into the white void. Draw, find a draw. He is looking for any depression in the land, a coulee, a small valley, a stand of cottonwood trees, anything to break the full, screaming force of the wind. The number one priority is the herd. The entire crew's wealth, their very reason for being here, is tied up in these 3,000 animals. The point riders, their heads down, lead the terrified mass toward a shallow depression they had passed an hour before. The flank and swing riders become heroes. They ride into the teeth of the wind, the sleet cutting their faces, their horses rearing. They force the cattle to turn, to stop drifting with the storm. They begin to mill the herd. This is a life-saving technique. They force the thousands of cattle to walk in a tight, massive circle. The movement generates body heat, a massive column of steam rising from the herd. It keeps the animals from freezing on their feet. And, critically, it keeps them together, preventing the stampede. This is grueling, miserable work. Riders will have to stay with the herd all night, in shifts, riding in that same circle, their bodies slowly turning to ice. The second priority is the chuckwagon cookie. A man of iron will wrestles his team of mules, who are panicked by the storm. He knows the rule. He finds the most sheltered spot he can, on the leeward side of the small rise, and he parks the wagon. He faces the back of the wagon, his kitchen, away from the wind. The wagon itself now becomes the crew's only solid windbreak, a tiny island of shelter in the roaring storm. The third priority is fire, and fire requires fuel. On the plains, wood is a luxury they do not have. The primary fuel, the lifeblood of the prairie, is buffalo chips, dried bison dung. But the snow is already covering the ground. Chips, get the chips. The cook roars. The men not immediately assigned to the herd drop from their saddles. Their hands are already numb, their fingers clumsy. They scramble across the frozen ground, kicking at the new snow, searching for the dark, frozen discs of dung. They stuff them into their shirts, into canvas bags. It is a frantic, desperate harvest, a race to gather fuel before it is buried completely. Back at the wagon, the cook begins his most difficult task. He crouches behind the canvas flaps, shielded from the worst of the wind. He struggles to start a fire. His matches snap. The tinder is damp. The chips are frozen. The smoke is ripped away by the wind. Finally, after agonizing minutes, a small, stubborn flame catches. He guards it with his life, feeding it chip by chip. Soon, the greatest smell in the world cuts through the storm, the sharp, welcome aroma of hot coffee. It is a lifeline. It is a promise of warmth, a signal of morale. The cook boils a massive pot. He throws slabs of bacon into a skillet. He heats a pot of beans, and, using the sourdough starter he keeps in a small keg, he bakes biscuits in a heavy Dutch oven buried in the coals. The meal is simple. It is hot. It is dense with calories. The grub line forms. Men, their shoulders hunched, their hats pulled low, emerge from the whiteout. They line up, taking their tin plates. They eat standing, their backs to the wind, huddling near the wagon. The food is hot for only a moment before the cold seeps into it. They gulp the scalding, black coffee. It is not a meal, it is fuel. It is the heat they need to survive the next few hours. The sound of the cook's triangle, the metal call to grub, is a weak, thin sound, but it is the sound of civilization. The camp is as secure as it can be. The herd is a massive, dark shape in the blizzard, milling their backs to the wind. The horses are tied on the leeward side of the wagon. The fire sputters. Total darkness has fallen, though it is only late afternoon. Now, as the full, deadly force of the blizzard settles in for a long night, the men, not on the first night guard rotation, face their personal battle. The battle for sleep. That Hollywood myth of a man in a single blanket by the fire. In this storm, that would be a death sentence. Making the bed is not a casual act. It is a survival ritual. It is a science, a desperate fight against two enemies, the cold from the air and the cold from the ground. The cowboy's bedroll is his only private property, his only home on the trail. It is not a sleeping bag. It is a component system, and every piece is vital. The first and most important component is the tarp. This is not a thin piece of plastic. It is a massive sheet of heavy canvas, often 7 feet wide and 16 feet long. It has been waterproofed with linseed oil or even paint, and in the freezing cold, it is as stiff and unyielding as a sheet of metal. It snaps and flaps violently in the wind as the cowboy tries to lay it out. The second component is a ground sheet. This is a smaller, extra piece of canvas, or even a rubber slicker. This piece is critical. A man lying directly on the frozen ground, even with blankets, will have his life-sustaining warmth stolen from him. The ground is a heat sink, an endless void that will pull the warmth from his body until his heart stops. The ground sheet is the barrier against this. Inside the tarp go the sugons, or sugons. These are the blankets. They are almost always wool. A cowboy might have 2, 3, or, if he is prosperous, 4. Wool is the miracle fiber of the frontier. Unlike cotton, it retains its insulating properties even when it gets damp from snowmelt or breathing. The war bag, a simple sack holding a man's extra socks, his tobacco, his letters, and maybe a small book, often serves as his pillow. The process is methodical. He finds a spot, hopefully sheltered by the wagon or a small drift. He lays down his ground sheet first. On top of that, he unrolls his massive tarp. He lays his wool sugans carefully in the center. Then, he folds the tarp over the blankets, first the bottom up, then the sides over, creating a long, narrow envelope. He does not sleep too close to the fire. The wind is whipping sparks and hot embers from the buffalo chips. A single spark, landing on his canvas tarp, could set his entire bedroll ablaze, turning his only shelter into a fiery trap. He carefully, ritually, tucks his gear. His boots are placed under the tarp, near his feet. If he leaves them out, the leather will freeze as solid as rock by morning. They will be impossible to put on. His hat, likewise, is tucked away, and in a storm like this, few men sleep alone. He finds his bunkie, his trail partner. It is common, and it is necessary, for two cowboys to share a bedroll. They spoon together, their combined body heat the only thing capable of warming the small space inside the canvas. This is not a matter of comfort. It is a matter of survival. Finally, the cowboy, shivering, his clothes stiff with ice, crawls into the stiff, cold canvas cocoon. He pulls the final flap of the tarp over his head, creating a small pocket of air. He lies there in the total darkness, feeling the frozen ground, hard as iron, even through the layers. He hears the wind howling outside, a high-pitched demonic shriek. He hears the constant, violent snap of the canvas, just inches from his face. And he hears the low, miserable groaning of the nearby herd. The camp is set. The men are in their bedrolls. The long, frozen night has truly begun, and the battle for sleep and for life has only just started. As our trail crew settles in for this brutal, long night, it makes you wonder about other epic survival stories from history. If there's a specific event, a lost expedition, or a figure known for their incredible endurance you'd like to hear a story about, please let me know in the comments below. We'll add it to our list of future journeys as we now move deeper into the frozen darkness. The frantic scramble is over. The camp, such as it is set. The herd is a great dark mass, groaning and milling in the blizzard. The wind does not pause, it does not rest. It is a constant, screaming assault. For the men hunkered down in their bedrolls, the immediate panic of the storm's arrival has passed, but it has been replaced by something else, a long, cold, and deadly calculation. The battle for survival has given way to the science of survival. The pace of the night changes now. It is no longer a race. It is an endurance. It becomes a deliberate, slow, and reflective process of conserving every single calorie, every spark of warmth. The men in their canvas cocoons are not just sleeping. They are actively fighting the laws of physics. They are relying on a simple, brilliant system of technology, honed not in a laboratory, but by bitter experience on the high plains. To understand how they will make it to morning, we must first understand the single most important possession a cowboy owned. It was not his horse, it was not his gun, it was his bed. The cowboy bedroll was, in many ways, his home. It was his only private space, his only castle, his refuge, and it was a marvel of frontier engineering. It did not just appear, it evolved. Its origins trace back to the Mexican vaqueros, the true originators of the cattle culture. The vaquero often traveled with a simple serape, a beautifully woven wool blanket. It was a masterpiece of in-town wear, and it was a passable blanket on a warm, dry night. But in the wet and the cold, a single wool blanket was not enough. The American cowboys, pushing farther north into the ranges of Kansas, Wyoming, and Montana, needed something more. They needed a system. And the key to that system, the great innovation, was the tarp. This was a massive sheet of heavy canvas. We are not talking about a thin, lightweight ground cloth. This was a piece of industrial-grade material, often 7 feet wide and 16 feet long. But canvas alone is not waterproof. It will soak through, so it had to be treated. This was done by hand, a miserable job. The cowboy would lay out his canvas and paint it, often with linseed oil, or sometimes just with common house paint. This process made the canvas water-resistant and, just as importantly, windproof. But it also made it incredibly heavy and stiff. In the freezing cold of a blue norther, this oiled canvas became as rigid as a sheet of tin. It was loud, it was clumsy, and it was hard to manage. But it was the barrier that made life possible. The specific size, roughly 7 by 16 feet, was the genius of the design. It was not arbitrary. It was a precise pattern. A cowboy would lay it flat. He would place his blankets, his sugans, in the center. The word sugan, by the way, is a lovely piece of history itself, a word that drifted west from the Irish drgaelic term for a quilt or a coverlet. Once the wool sugans were in place, the cowboy would fold the bottom of the long tarp up, perhaps 6 feet, creating a pocket for his feet. Then he would fold one side over, and then the other, creating a long, narrow envelope. The remaining portion at the top folded down like a flap, allowing him to pull it over his head. This created a sealed, windproof, waterproof cocoon. Inside this canvas shell were the blankets, 2, 3, or, if a man was fortunate, 4 of them. And beneath it all, a smart cowboy would have his ground sheet, an extra piece of canvas, or his rubber slicker. To fight the enemy, we will discuss later, the ground. Add to this his war bag, a sack with his spare socks, tobacco, and letters, which served as his pillow, and the entire bundle became a significant piece of luggage. A full bedroll, with its heavy tarp, multiple wool blankets, and personal items, could easily weigh 50 to 75 pounds. This was not something a man carried on his saddle. It was transported on the chuck wagon, or, in a smaller outfit, on a dedicated pack mule. It represented a massive investment. A good bedroll could cost a month's wages, or more. It was a cowboy's stake in the world. Losing it, perhaps in a river crossing or a stampede, was a disaster on par with losing his horse. So, when our cowboy, his face numb and his beard caked with ice, crawled into this frozen, stiff envelope, what did he feel? First, the smell, the distinct, oily temps of the waterproofed canvas, a smell that meant protection. And beneath that, the comforting, dry, almost animal smell of the wool blankets. Then the weight, the surprising, reassuring pressure of all those heavy layers on top of him. And finally, the sound, the roaring, screaming shriek of the blizzard, which had been deafening only seconds before, suddenly became muffled. It was distant. The world shrank from a terrifying open chaos to a small, dark, protected cave. A cave he would slowly begin to warm with his own body heat. There were tricks, of course. If a man had the time and the forethought, he would find a good, flat stone, a hot rock, and place it near the fire. He would let it heat up, not so hot that it would scorch his blankets, but hot enough to hold a deep, lasting warmth. He would wrap it in a spare piece of cloth or a sock and place it at the foot of his bedroll, a personal, primitive hot water bottle that could save his feet from frostbite. But this system had its dangers. The fire, which gave the hot rock, was also a mortal enemy. A single stray spark, carried on the swirling wind, could land on his oily canvas tarp. He could wake up trapped inside a flaming envelope. It was a constant, terrifying risk. He had to bed down far enough away to be safe, but close enough to feel the fire's psychological comfort. This was the shell. This was the house. But the true engine of warmth was what he wore into the bed. This brings us to the gospel of wool. In the 19th century, wool was not just a fabric, it was a miracle fiber. It was the absolute foundation of winter survival, a piece of technology perfected by nature. Today, we are surrounded by synthetic fleeces and waterproof breathable membranes. The cowboy had none of this. He had wool, and he had cotton, and making the wrong choice was a death sentence. There was a saying on the frontier, a piece of wisdom that is still taught to mountaineers and hikers today. Cotton kills. Let us understand why. Cotton, the fabric of a bandana or a pair of jeans, is wonderfully comfortable when it is dry. But when it gets wet from sweat, rain, or melting snow, it does two terrible things. First, it loses all of its insulating value. The fibers collapse and stick to the skin. Second, it becomes a heat sink. It actively pulls warmth from the body, conducting it into the cold air. A wet cotton shirt in a blizzard will freeze solid, becoming a sheet of ice against the skin, leading to rapid, fatal hypothermia. Wool, on the other hand, is magical. The very structure of a wool fiber is complex. It can absorb a massive amount of moisture, up to 30% of its own weight, before it even begins to feel wet to the touch. And here is the miracle. Even when damp, it retains its insulating properties. The fibers do not collapse. They maintain their loft, the tiny pockets of air that trap body heat. Furthermore, wool naturally wicks moisture. The fibers pull perspiration away from the skin and move it toward the outer surface of the fabric, where it can evaporate. So, the cowboy's entire wardrobe was a layering system built on this miracle fiber. The first layer, against the skin, was a wool union suit. This was one-piece long underwear, from neck to wrist to ankle. It was heavy, it was scratchy, it was certainly not comfortable by modern standards, but it was the foundation. It was the wicking layer. Over this, he wore a wool shirt. This was often a bib-front shirt, a style with a reinforced panel of fabric on the chest, providing an extra layer of wind protection and durability. His trousers, too, were wool. Denim jeans, if he wore them at all, were for warm weather work. In the winter, wool was the only choice. California-style pants were common, with reinforced seats and pockets, built for a life in the saddle. Perhaps the most critical piece of clothing was his waistcoat or vest. This may seem like a formal, old-fashioned item, but its value was immense. The vest provides no warmth to the arms or legs. It concentrates all of its insulation on the body's core. Survival is not about keeping your fingers warm. It is about keeping your heart, your lungs, and your internal organs warm. The vest did this better than anything. His socks were wool. This was arguably the most important item of all. A cowboy would guard his wool socks with his life. He would almost always carry a spare, dry pair in his war bag, or even inside his shirt, using his own body heat to dry a damp pair. Cold, wet feet were the first step toward frostbite, and frostbite could mean losing his toes, his job, and his life. Of course, a man had to be careful not to overheat. This is a strange paradox of the cold. If a man worked too hard, say wrestling a calf or gathering firewood, he would begin to sweat. That sweat would soak his wool union suit, and while the wool would not freeze like cotton, That dampness would still create a serious chill the moment he stopped moving. He had to learn to manage his own internal furnace. For the men on guard duty, the men who could not crawl into a bedroll, there was one more layer, the slicker. This was a long duster-style coat made of the same oiled canvas as the bedroll. It provided almost no warmth. Its job was to be a completely waterproof and, more importantly, windproof shell. It was the armor against the wind. In the blizzard, these slickers would become frozen solid, caked in ice, so stiff they could practically stand up on their own. And finally, if a man was wealthy or had been on the drive for a long time, he might have a heavy wool overcoat, like a military-style frock coat, or, the ultimate luxury, a sheepskin coat, with the heavy hide on the outside and the thick, warm fleece on the inside. This was their technology. Wool against the skin, wool for insulation, and oiled canvas for the shell. Every item was heavy, every item was scratchy, but every item, worked. They were wearing a system designed for one thing, and one thing only, to keep a man alive when the world was trying to kill him. So, they had their bedroll, and they had their wool. The third element of survival, that iconic image of the Old West, was the campfire. But in this storm, the fire was a fickle and dangerous friend. It was a false hope. We are drawn to fire, its light, its sound, its warmth. For the crew huddled by the chuck wagon, the small, sputtering fire of buffalo chips was a massive psychological comfort. It was a focal point of civilization in the roaring, white chaos. It was the one spot of color, that hypnotic orange-yellow dance, in a universe of blue and white and black. It was a signal that they were not yet beaten. But its physical reality was deeply disappointing. A fire heats through radiation. It only heats what it sees. In a calm, still forest, you can build a fire and feel its warmth. But on the open plains, with a 60-mile-per-hour wind swirling and carrying the snow horizontally, that radiant heat was ripped away before it could travel more than a few feet. This created the rotisserie problem, a miserable experience all frontiersmen knew well. A man would stand by the fire, the front of his body, the part seeing the flames, would be roasting. His face would sting. The smoke, carried on the wild, swirling wind, would constantly get in his eyes, and all the while, his back, exposed to the wind, would be freezing. So, he would turn, constantly, slowly roasting one side, while the other side froze. It was an exhausting, smoky, and ultimately futile way to stay warm. The only way to get real heat from a fire was to use the reflector principle. The chuck wagon, parked to block the wind, was the perfect reflector. The heat would hit the wagon's side and bounce back at the men huddled there. If they were truly desperate, they would build a long, thin Siberian fire, which allowed more men to get close to its surface, and they might even build a wall of their saddles to bounce the heat. The fire also had a voracious appetite. A fire in a blizzard, burning for warmth, consumes an enormous amount of fuel. And fuel, the buffalo chips, was now buried under snow. Keeping it fed was a full-time, miserable job. One man might be tasked as the fire guard for the night, his sole duty to crouch in the smoke, feeding chip after chip into the embers, his own body slowly freezing just feet away from the flames. So, what was the fire's true value? It was not for warmth. It was for life. Its primary role was melting snow. A man in the freezing cold is still desperate for water. But eating snow is a deadly mistake. Your body must expend a massive amount of precious core-warming energy to melt that snow in your mouth and raise it to body temperature. Eating snow directly lowers your core temperature. The fire, however, could melt a pot of snow, turning it into water that could be drunk, or, even better, used for its second great purpose: coffee, hot, black, scalding coffee, hot beans, and bacon. This was the hotline to survival. The fire's true purpose was to heat the men from the inside. That hot liquid, that dense calorie food, was the internal fuel that allowed their bodies to shiver, to fight back, to generate their own warmth. The psychological comfort was real, but the physical salvation came from the coffee pot, not the flame. And that flame, even in a blizzard, carried a risk. A powerful gust could catch a red-hot ember and carry it to a patch of dry grass, exposed by the wind. A prairie fire was a new, unthinkable disaster. The fire was a tool, a necessary and dangerous one, but it was not the savior the myths make it out to be. The air is lethal. The fire is fickle. But the most insidious, most dangerous enemy of all was the one they were lying on. The true enemy was the ground. This is the science of conduction. We lose heat in several ways, but conduction, heat loss through direct physical contact, is the most efficient and the most deadly. The air in the blizzard might be 0 degrees, but the air is a gas. It is a poor conductor of heat. The frozen ground, on the other hand, is a solid. It is a massive, endless heat sink. Think of it as a heat vampire. It has infinitely more mass than a human body. When you lie on it, even with blankets, it will suck the warmth from your body without pause. It will pull that heat from your bones, your muscles, your organs, until you are the same temperature as it is. 10 degrees, 0. It will never stop pulling. This is the battle the cowboy truly had to win. His bedroll was not designed to fight the air. It was designed to fight the ground. This is why the ground sheet, that extra layer of rubber or oiled canvas, was so critical. It was the primary barrier against conduction, but it was not enough on its own. The real survival technique was in making the bed. A smart cowboy, even in the driving snow, would not just throw his bedroll down. First, he would use his hands or a small shovel to scrape away the snow, getting down to the bare, frozen earth. You never, ever sleep on snow. Your body heat will melt it, and you will wake up soaked in ice water. Once on the bare ground, he would dig. He would scrape out a shallow hip hole and a shoulder hole. This was not just for comfort, though it did allow him to lie flat on his back. It was about fitting his body to the earth. Then, the most important step, insulation. He would gather anything dry he could find. Dry grass, scrub brush, leaves, anything the wind had not stolen or the snow had not soaked. He would pile this dunnage onto the spot where he would sleep. He would even use his saddle blanket. He would lay his ground sheet on top of this pile. He would unroll his bedroll. That layer of scratchy, lumpy brush created dead air. It created a space, an insulating barrier of trapped air that the ground's cold could not easily cross. This, finally, broke the chain of conduction. His saddle, that other vital tool, was often placed at the head of his bedroll to act as a windbreak. Every piece of his gear was part of a single, integrated survival system. If he failed, if his insulation was too thin, he would feel it. A deep, penetrating, aching cold that seeped up from the earth into his back and his bones. He would wake up, shivering violently, to find that the outside asterisk of his tarp, damp from his own body heat, had frozen solid to the ground. He would be literally stuck to the earth that was killing him. Picking the right bed ground was a skill that separated the veterans from the greenhorns. Never in a low spot, a draw, or a gully. Cold air, being heavier, sinks and pools in these places, and if a sudden thaw came, they would be the first to flood. A cowboy always slept on the highest ground he could find, and always on the lee side, the sheltered side, of the chuck wagon, a cut bank, or a stand of trees. When he finally got it right, the feeling was not one of warmth. It was a feeling of neutrality. It was the moment he could no longer feel that heat vampire pulling at him. He was in a small, self-contained world. He was no longer losing heat. He was in his canvas cocoon, wearing his wool armor, insulated from the enemy below. He had used science, wool, and his own wits to create a tiny pocket of life in the midst of a frozen, howling death. This constant, exhausting battle against the elements, using only wool, canvas, and wits, is a true testament to their endurance. It really makes you think about the simple comforts we take for granted. What's one modern camping item you think these cowboys would have valued the most? As we ponder that, the fire dies down, and the true, deep cold of the night sets in. The fire, that small beacon of hope, is now dying. It is a small, red eye in the vast, swirling darkness. The men not on guard are in their bedrolls. The camp is silent. The action is over. The frantic scramble to make camp, the desperate fight to get food and warmth, has given way to the long, slow, and profound battle of the night. The pace slows, the world shrinks. The fight is no longer against the storm, but against the clock, and against the cold. This is the part of the night where the world is defined not by sight, for there is none, but by sound. We are inside the bedroll with one of our cowboys. He has been lying in the dark for an hour, or maybe it is 3. He cannot tell. He is in a small, dark, enclosed world, a canvas cocoon, and his reality is a symphony of the storm. There is, first, the silence. This is the great paradox of a blizzard. The heavy, falling snow is a blanket for the world, and it absorbs sound. It deadens it. The world feels muffled, close, and strangely intimate. It is a deafening silence, a heavy quiet that seems to press in on the camp from all sides. But this silence is a canvas, and upon it the storm paints its sounds. The loudest sound is the wind. It is not a whoosh, it is a shriek, a high-pitched, tearing howl that seems to have no origin. It is the voice of the empty, featureless plains, a sound that rises and falls in pitch, but never, ever stops. It is a constant, terrifying reminder of the power just inches away. Sometimes, a powerful gust hits the camp, a sudden whoosh that seems to physically press the heavy canvas tarp down onto the man's chest. The next sound is the rattling, the hard, sharp ticking of sleet against the stiff, frozen canvas of his bedroll. It is a sound as close as his own thoughts, a constant drumming just inches from his face. It is the sound of the enemy trying to get in. He can hear the larger canvas of the chuck wagon cover flapping and snapping violently, a sound like a pistol shot in the night. And then there are the sounds of life. From the herd, there is a physical vibration. He can feel it through the frozen ground, a low, thrumming, nervous energy. It is the sound of thousands of hooves stamping and shuffling in the snow. It is the sound of 3,000 animals huddling together for warmth, miserable and terrified. This vibration is punctuated by a low, mournful lowing. It is a sound of deep discomfort, a chorus of misery that rises and falls with the wind. Closer, from the lee side of the chuck wagon, he hears the horses. They are not lowing. He hears a sudden, sharp nicker, a sound of animal companionship. They are huddled together, their backs to the wind, their manes and tails caked in ice. They stamp their own hooves, a sharper, clearer sound than the dull thud of the cattle. And if there are any trees nearby, perhaps in the small draw they have sheltered in, there is another sound, a sudden, sharp crack, like a rifle. It is a cottonwood branch, its sap frozen, splitting in the intense cold. But through all of this, another sound weaves. It is the sound of the night guard. At first, it is just the faint, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of a single horse walking a slow, endless circle in the snow. It is the sound of vigilance, and then, carried on the wind, he hears a voice. It is the night guard, singing. He is singing an old, slow song. Perhaps it is Old Paint, or Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie. His voice is not good. It is thin, and the wind tears it away. But it is the most human sound in the world. This is a common practice. The singing does two things. It soothes the nervous milling cattle, the sound of a human voice, a small anchor in the chaos. And, just as importantly, it proves to the rest of the camp, and to any other guards, where he is. It is a beacon of sound, a way to say, I am still here, I am still on duty, I am not lost. Inside his canvas cocoon, the cowboy hears this muffled, distant, rhythmic song. He feels the vibration of the herd. He hears the rattling of the sleet on his tarp, and he listens to the quiet, close, muffled sound of his own breathing. He is in the dark, but he is not alone. The world is alive with the symphony of the storm. The sounds are all around him, but the most immediate, the most visceral sensations are happening right inside his small, dark world. The battle is now within the cocoon itself. The cowboy cannot simply pull the blankets over his head and breathe. If he did, the moisture from his breath would saturate the wool, and he would suffocate or freeze. He has to create a breathing hole. He has angled his head just so, with the canvas flap folded over, to create a small, narrow tunnel to the outside air. He is breathing the same 0-degree air as the storm, and this is where the cold begins to build. His warm, moist breath, as he exhales, hits the cold air and the inside of his canvas tarp, and it freezes instantly. The condensation does not form as water. It forms as ice. A small, delicate, white rime of frost begins to grow around his breathing hole. It is like the delicate, feathery ice on a window pane. It is the physical evidence of his own precious, life-sustaining warmth. For the men with beards or mustaches, this becomes an ice mask. With every breath, the moisture catches in their facial hair. Within an hour, their beards are frozen solid. A cage of ice, rough and sharp, forms around their mouths and noses. If they move, it scrapes against their skin. He has to be careful. He must breathe out through the tunnel, not down, into his blankets. To breathe into the sugans would be a terrible mistake. That moisture would get trapped in the wool fibers, where it would freeze, destroying their insulation. His own breath would become his enemy, turning his sanctuary into a trap. He can feel a single, damp, cold, clammy spot on the blanket near his face, where his breath has frozen. It is a small, personal patch of misery. And then there is the ache, the cold from the ground. That heat vampire is still pulling at him. The lumpy bed of brush he made is helping, but it is not perfect. He can feel a deep, penetrating, dull ache in his joints. It is in his hip and his shoulder, the parts of his body that press hardest into the earth. It is a cold that feels like it is in his very bones. No amount of shifting can relieve it. His toes and fingers are the first to truly suffer. He wiggles them deep inside his wool socks and his bedroll. He can feel the pins and needles sensation, the first warning sign of frostnip. He knows he must keep wiggling them. He must keep the blood moving. But the body has its own defenses. As his core temperature begins to drop, he is suddenly seized by a fit of violent, involuntary shivering. His whole body begins to shake uncontrollably. This is not a choice. It is his body's last-ditch, desperate effort to generate heat by rapidly contracting his muscles. It is a sign that he is on the edge, and it makes sleep, true, deep sleep, impossible. This is the great, terrible irony of the night. He is exhausted. He is physically drained, so tired that his mind feels numb. But he is too cold to sleep. His body will not let him shut down. He lies there, shivering, aching, his mind caught in a gray, hazy state between consciousness and oblivion. He feels the claustrophobic, heavy feeling of the stiff, frozen, snow-covered canvas pinning him down. And yet, in the very center of his chest, he can feel it. A small, tiny, precious patch of warmth. It is the heat from his own core. It is the small, living fire he is guarding. All his work, the wool, the canvas, the ground sheet, is about one thing: protecting that tiny, fist-sized patch of warmth. If he should fall asleep and his fingers get to numb, he might wake to the hot take. This is the other paradox. It is the intense, burning, stinging pain of thawing out frozen extremities. Many say this pain, the feeling of life flooding back into deadened tissue, is far worse than the cold itself. For the men in their bedrolls, it is a battle of passive endurance. It is a long, cold, aching wait for the dawn. But for one man, at any given time, it is an active, waking nightmare. We now shift our perspective to the man who cannot sleep. The man who is on the night guard. His shift is 2 hours long. But in the teeth of a blue norther, in the total, swirling, whiteout darkness, it is an eternity. He is on his horse, a dark shape against the snow. His primary job is to keep the herd from drifting. The cattle, in their misery, will turn their backs to the screaming north wind, and they will simply walk. They will walk all night, driven by the storm, and in the morning they will be scattered for 10 miles. Or, worse, they will panic and stampede. The night guard's job is to ride in a slow, constant, miserable circle, always on the upwind side of the herd. He and his horse are the wall. They are the barrier that keeps the cattle huddled, milling, and safe. He is the man we heard singing. He sings "Bury Me Not" on the lone prairie, his voice cracking in the cold. He sings to soothe the thousands of terrified animals. But he also sings to stay sane. He sings to remind himself that he is still there. And he sings so that the other guard, if there are 2 of them, can hear his position. The greatest, most immediate danger for this man is not the cold, though the cold is trying to kill him. It is the fear of getting lost. He is riding in a whiteout. The camp, with its tiny, sputtering fire, is just 100 yards behind him. But if he were to lose his bearings, to ride just 50 yards too far into the storm. He would be gone, hopelessly, completely lost. He would ride in circles until he and his horse froze solid. He is an astronaut, floating in a void. His only tether, the low, groaning sound of the herd. His horse is his true partner. This is a shared misery. The horse's warm breath steams in the dark. He can feel it on his frozen, gloved hand. The horse's mane and tail are caked in solid ice. The rider, his own body numb, huddles behind the horse's neck, using the animal's large body as a temporary, moving windbreak. He feels a profound, unspoken bond with this animal, the only other living thing in his immediate, swirling chaos. He is completely isolated. He is the only human awake and moving in a world of roaring wind and ice. Frostbite is not a risk. It is a his nose, his ears, the tips of his fingers, the tops of his toes, they are numb. He cannot feel them. He knows the damage is being done. He accepts it. It is the cost of the job. He longs for his bedroll. He dreams of it. He does not care that it is cold and damp. It is shelter. It is a paradise compared to this. After what feels like a lifetime, he rides his horse back toward the dim orange glow of the fire. He is a statue of ice. His frozen slicker cracks as he dismounts. His first act is to stumble to the fire, where the coffee pot has been kept on the embers all night. He pours a cup. It is lukewarm. It is gritty. It is impossibly, unbelievably bitter, and it is the best taste in the world. It is the taste of life. Now he faces the grim but welcome duty. He walks to his bunky's bedroll, a snow-covered mound near the wagon. He kicks it. "Your watch," he croaks, his voice rough. He is waking his friend, sending him out into that hell. But his own watch is over. He crawls into the bedroll. His partner has just left, a space that holds a faint, residual warmth. He is shivering so hard he cannot control his limbs, but he has never felt such relief. He is, for now, safe. The last, longest watch of the night is ending. The final guard, half frozen, his face a mask of ice, returns to the camp. He is making his way to the coffee pot, but as he does, he stops. He looks to the east, and he sees the first faint change. It is not light. It is a false dawn. It is a simple graying of the blackness. The world is no longer pure black. It is a deep, bruised indigo. But it is the signal. The night is broken. Slowly, agonizingly, the sun begins to rise. It is not a glorious, warm sunrise. It is a pale, weak, watery disk. It seems to struggle to get above the horizon. It offers almost no heat, but it offers immense, overwhelming hope. It means they have survived, and it reveals the world. The storm has passed. The wind has died down to a breeze. The world is a silent, sterile, and beautiful alien landscape. It is pure white and blue. Snowdrifts are piled against the chuck wagon, burying one of all the wheels. The bedrolls are just white, rounded mounds. The herd is a vast, dark, steaming mass, their backs caked in snow. Slowly, painfully, the camp comes back to life. The first sound is the creaking. It is the sound of men, stiff as boards, emerging from their frozen cocoons. Their joints ache. Their muscles are frozen. They move like old, old men. Their bedrolls, which saved their lives, are now their enemy. The canvas is frozen solid. The blankets are stiff with ice from their breath. The entire 75-pound roll must be thawed or, more likely, beaten with a shovel to crack the ice, just so it can be folded. It is the hardest, most miserable chore of the day. But then, the real asterisk sound of morning comes. The sharp, clear, glorious clang, clang, clang of cookies' iron triangle. It is the call to breakfast. It is the sound of survival, and the smell. The glorious, life-affirming hot smell of frying bacon, what they call sowbelly, and the rich, powerful aroma of fresh, strong, boiling coffee. The men, their faces marked with frostbite, huddle around the fire. They are given hot sourdough biscuits, slabs of bacon, and they drink gallons of the scalding coffee. It is a celebration. The trail boss and the point riders, already on their horses, circle the herd. This is the grim accounting. They count. They look for the cattle that froze on their feet, that died standing up. They look at the ground, littered with frozen birds and rabbits that could not find shelter, a stark reminder of what they all just endured. The men are rolling up their frozen tarps, a brutal, exhausting job. They are aching. They are frostbitten. They are completely, utterly exhausted, but they are alive. And so, the sun climbs. The blue norther has passed, leaving a transformed, silent, and beautiful world in its wake. Our crew, aching and exhausted, has made it through. They survived, not through romantic, cinematic toughness, but through grim endurance, community, good wool, and the desperate, practiced science of warmth. Their long night is over, a story of survival etched in the ice of the prairie. I hope this journey into the cold has, in its own way, helped you find your own warm, comfortable, and safe place to rest. We're about to explore what this night meant in the grander story of the West. But for now, just relax. If you're still with us, I'd love to hear what part of their story felt the most real to you. Let the sounds of the morning camp fade, and let your mind drift. Our journey has followed the night of one trail crew, a single frozen point in time. It has been a story of immediate crisis, of survival measured in minutes and hours, of a handful of men against one storm. But their story, intense as it was just one part of a much larger, colder reality. The great cattle drives, the thundering herds, the dust and the sun, these were, by and large, a summer affair. Winter was a different war entirely. It was a long, slow siege, fought not just on the trail, but in the desolate, profound quiet of the ranches themselves. As we settle in, we now move our gaze from that single, frantic night to the broader, colder context of winter in the American West. For not all cowboys were on the move, chasing the herds north. Many were ranch hands, men hired to stay, to watch over the cattle that remained, and to simply ... endure. Their experience of winter was not a stampede in a blizzard, but a slow, grinding, and deeply isolating vigil. And the shelters they used were monuments to that isolation, structures of pure necessity, built with whatever the empty land offered. Consider the line, shack. The name itself speaks of its stark purpose. These were tiny, one-room cabins, often built miles and miles from the main ranch house, and miles more from any other human soul. They were outposts, lonely satellites in a sea of frozen grass and snow. A single rider, or perhaps two, would be stationed here, alone, for weeks or even months on end. His job was to ride the line. In the later days of the open range, this meant a grim daily patrol, checking the new and controversial barbed wire fences for breaks. In earlier times, it meant simply riding a vast, invisible perimeter, keeping an eye on a distant section of the ranch's territory, and pushing back any cattle that drifted too far. The construction of these shacks was almost always crude, a thing of pure, desperate function. It might be built from rough-hewn logs. If a stand of cottonwoods could be found in a distant river bottom, the gaps between the logs would be chinked with mud, clay, or even old rags, a poor and porous defense against a piercing, relentless wind. Sometimes it was just planks, hauled at great expense and nailed together into a small, thin-walled box, barely larger than a modern bedroom. In the very earliest days, some line shacks were little more than a wooden frame with heavy canvas stretched over it, a tent pretending to be a house. The sound of that canvas in a 50-miler gale, snapping and booming and cracking like gunfire, all night long, must have been a constant, drumming torment. Inside, there was no comfort. There was only survival. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. A simple cot or bunk in one corner, a small table, and the most important object in the cowboy's world, the stove. It was usually a small cast-iron pot-belly stove, inefficient and profoundly greedy. It demanded constant feeding. The cowboy's life in winter revolved around this stove. His waking hours were a loop of labor in its service, gathering scarce firewood, or, more often, scouring the frozen prairie for cow chips. These dried chunks of manure were the only fuel available in many places. They burned hot and fast, meaning the stove could never be left unattended for long. Even at night, the rider would have to wake every few hours, his breath frosting in the air, to feed the hungry iron mouth, or risk waking to a cabin as cold as the air outside. The light, what little there was, came from a single, small window. Often, this was not even glass, but a piece of greased paper or translucent rawhide, which let in a weak, gray, depressing light. In the long, dark afternoons of deep winter, the only illumination came from a flickering kerosene lamp. Its oily yellow glow cast long, dancing shadows on the crude walls, a single point of light in a universe of darkness. The wind was a constant, audible presence. It was never quiet. It whistled and moaned through the countless cracks in the walls. It sounded, as one cowboy wrote, like a lonely spirit trying to get in. But the cold was only one enemy. The other was the silence and the isolation. It was profound. It was maddening. A man could go an entire winter seeing no one but his own horse. His only companions were the pages of a single worn-out book, read and reread until the text was memorized, and the sound of his own voice speaking to his horse or to himself just to break the spell. He would ride his line, his face wrapped in wool against the bitter air, checking fences that seemed to stretch into infinity. He would return to the shack, the cold clinging to him. He would cook his simple meal, the repeating menu of beans, salt, pork, and coffee. He would listen to the wind, and he would wait. The vast, open stillness of the plains, so beautiful and liberating in the summer, became a psychological weight in winter. It pressed in on him, a vast, white, featureless emptiness that threatened to swallow his own thoughts, to erase his own sense of self. This was the line shack, a box against the cold, a fragile shell against the emptiness. But other shelters went deeper. They sought refuge, not asterisk against asterisk the land, but asterisk in asterisk the land itself. This was the dugout. Just as the name implies, a dugout was a shelter built by digging. It was a human burrow. A man would find a suitable slope, often the side of a small hill, a riverbank, or a dry ravine known as a draw, and he would simply excavate a room from the packed, dense earth. The front of this man-made cave would then be walled off. Sometimes this front wall was made of simple planks, if they could be had. But just as often, it was built with the only other material available, the earth. This made the dugout incredibly primitive, but also remarkably effective as a shelter. The earth itself, packed hard by centuries, provided a massive thermal barrier. The temperature inside a dugout remained surprisingly constant. Once a fire was lit in the small stove, the packed dirt walls and low ceiling would hold the meager warmth, shielding the inhabitant almost completely from the raging wind outside. No gale could penetrate 3 feet of solid ground, but this security came at a price. The feeling inside was one of being buried alive. It was a place of profound, permanent dampness. The smell was unforgettable. It was the scent of a potato cellar, a constant, heavy, earthy, musty odor that clung to blankets, to clothes, and to food. Water would often weep from the walls after a thaw, tracing muddy rivulets down the packed dirt. It was a space that felt both like a perfect shelter and a premature tomb. This use of the earth reached its logical and most famous conclusion in the most iconic shelter of the plains, a structure used by countless homesteaders and also by ranchers. This was the sod house, the soddy on the great treeless plains of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. Wood was a luxury. It was, in many places, more valuable than gold, hauled by wagon hundreds of miles. But there was one building material in endless, uniform supply: the ground itself. The prairie turf, baked by the sun for millennia, was not loose dirt. It was a dense, tangled mat of buffalo grass and bluestem roots, roots that went down feet deep, woven together as tightly as any textile. It was tough as leather. Men invented a special plow to harvest it. It was called a sod cutter or grasshopper plow. Pulled by a team of heavy oxen, it would slice into this tough turf, cutting long uniform ribbons, perhaps a foot wide and 4 to 6 inches thick. These heavy, damp strips, these prairie bricks, were then cut with a spade into manageable lengths, perhaps 2 or 3 feet long, and they were stacked, just like masonry, layer upon layer. The prairie bricks were laid down, grass side down, to build the walls of a house. The sheer weight of the bricks, and the way the roots locked together, made for a surprisingly stable structure. The walls went up, thick and solid, layer by earthy layer. A roof was laid over the top, often of simple cottonwood poles, covered with brush, and then more sod. A single small window and a single door were the only breaks in the earthen walls. The result was a house that looked as if it had grown organically from the prairie. It was a part of the landscape, not an imposition upon it. And the insulation, as with the dugout, was superb. The thick earthen walls, often 2 or 3 feet deep, were nearly impervious to the winter wind and the summer heat. They kept the house remarkably warm in winter, and just as remarkably cool in the scorching plains summer. But they were far from perfect. The floors were almost always packed dirt, impossible to ever get truly clean. And the roofs, ... The roofs were the great, notorious weakness. In a heavy rain, or a sudden spring thaw, they would leak. They would not just drip, they would become a saturated sponge, and a steady, muddy rain would fall from the ceiling for days. Pioneer women told stories of holding umbrellas over their stoves just to cook a meal, or moving their beds around the small room to chase a dry spot. And the walls themselves were alive. They were not sterile brick or dead wood. They was earth. And they were home to a thriving ecosystem. They were home to mice, to spiders, to ants, and, most unnerving of all, to garter snakes and bull snakes, who found the sod a comfortable, temperature-controlled place to live. The sound of mice and insects scurrying inside the walls, just inches from your head as you tried to sleep, was a constant, unsettling companion. The earthy potato cellar smell was pervasive. It was a life lived in close, unavoidable contact with the soil. Whether in a drafty line shack, a damp dugout, or a living soddy, the ranch hand's winter was a trial of quiet endurance. The potbelly stove was his fickle, demanding hearth. The wind was his constant, howling companion. The light came from a single kerosene lamp, casting long, flickering shadows on the crude walls. This was the permanent side of the cowboy's life, a side the myths rarely touch. It was a life of profound, uncomplaining hardship. These shelters, these tiny islands of human warmth, offered basic survival. They were a refuge, however primitive, for the men. But for the cattle, the vast, million-strong herds left to face the elements on the vast, open range, there was no shelter at all. They had only their hides and their instincts. And this vulnerability, this complete reliance on the mercy of the weather, was about to lead to a massive, industry-ending catastrophe. This event would signal, in one terrible season, the true end of the open-range cowboy. It is known as the Great Dup, or the Big Dup. It was the winter of 1886 to 1887, and it was a disaster forged from both human greed and natural fury. The stage was set long before the first snowflake fell. The 1880s had been the peak of the cattle boom. Eastern and European investors, lured by stories of immense, easy profits, had poured money into the cattle business. The ranges, particularly in the northern territories like Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, became dangerously overstocked. There were simply too many cattle for the land to support. Millions of cows competed for the same finite grass. Then came the summer of 1886. It was not a normal summer. It was a season of severe, suffocating drought. The sun beat down relentlessly. Rivers shrank to muddy trickles, and the prairie grass, already overgrazed, cured into a brittle, nutrient-poor fuzz. The cattle, already numerous, went into the autumn thin and weak. They had no reserves of fat to see them through the cold. The cattle barons, many of them absentees, living in comfort in New York or London, were warned by their seasoned foremen. The herds were too large, the grass was too poor, but the warnings were ignored. The boom was too profitable to question. The winter did not arrive gently. It hit early, and it hit with biblical force. In November of 1886, a massive blizzard roared out of the north. It was not a single storm, but the first wave of an assault. It dumped feet of snow across the northern plains, burying the meager, dried grass. The cattle, already weak, began to starve. And then the winter settled in. It was a season of blizzard after blizzard. One storm would pass, only to be followed by another, even more severe. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that stunned the land into silence. Temperatures plummeted to levels that are difficult to comprehend. Reports from ranchers, backed by military outposts, recorded sustained periods of 40, 50, and even 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, the very air seems to crackle. Exposed skin freezes in seconds. The cattle, driven by ancient instinct, tried to save themselves. A cow's natural defense against a blizzard is to turn its back to the wind and drift slowly south, hoping to walk out of the storm and find unburied grass. For centuries, this instinct had worked, but now the open range was no longer truly open. It was being sliced apart by a new invention, a new symbol of human control: barbed wire. The farmers, or nesters, had arrived, and they fenced their claims. Ranchers themselves had begun fencing off vast pastures and water sources. This new, modern invention became a death trap. The drifting herds, blinded by snow, heads low against the wind, would walk until they hit these new fences. Confused, they would not turn back into the wind. They would simply stop, piling up against the wire lines by the hundreds, and then by the thousands. And there they stood. They stood until the cold and the hunger overwhelmed them. They froze to death, standing up. When spring finally came, the settlers and cowboys would find them. Entire herds piled 10 feet high against the barbed wire fences, frozen solid. It was a ghastly, silent monument to the storm. In January of 1887, there was a brief, cruel thaw. A warm wind, a chinook, blew across the plains. For a few days, the snow melted. The cattle, desperate, tried to feed on the wet, exposed grass. But the thaw was a trap. It was followed immediately by another Arctic blast, a sudden, deep freeze. The melted snow and slush refroze, but not as soft snow. It refroze as a solid, thick sheet of ice, a crystal armor locking away the grass completely. The last meager source of food was now sealed, as if under glass. The cattle, unable to break the ice, simply gave up. They starved. They froze in the fields, in the ravines, and along the fence lines. The profound, eerie silence of the snow-covered plain was one of the most lasting memories for those who survived. There was no lowing of cattle. There was no life, just the wind and the snow. When the final, true thaw came in the spring of 1887, the scale of the disaster was revealed. The plains were not fields of grass. They were boneyards. They were littered, horizon to horizon, with the carcasses and skeletons of millions of cattle. The estimates were staggering. In some areas, ranchers lost 80, 90, or even 100% of their herds. The industry was not just damaged, it was obliterated. A young, aspiring rancher in the Dakotas named Theodore Roosevelt lost most of his herd, and with it, a huge portion of his wealth. He, like countless others, was bankrupted. The great cattle barons were ruined. The open-range cattle boom, that 20-year frenzy of beef and money, was over. It had been broken by one winter. The smell of the thaw was, by all accounts, horrific. The land, as it warmed, released the stench of decay on an industrial scale. The financial numbers were just as cold and hard, total ruin. This event changed the cowboy's job forever. The era of the open range, the unfenced sea of grass, was finished. The industry that rebuilt itself was one of smaller, fenced ranches. It was an industry that now had to grow and store hay for the winter, to feed its cattle rather than trust to nature. The long drive from Texas faded into legend, and the trail boss was replaced by the ranch hand, the very man we just pictured, wintering in his soddy or line shack. But what about the trail cowboys themselves? The men of our story, who had just spent 4 months pushing a herd north. What happened to them when the trail ended and the winter loomed? Their journey concluded in the roaring cow towns of Kansas, places like Abilene, Dodge City, or Wichita. At the end of the trail, after the cattle were sold and loaded onto trains, came the moment of paying off. The trail boss would settle his accounts, and the cowboys would be paid their wages for months of hard, dangerous work. A man might have a stake of over $100, a significant sum for the time. For many, what followed was the legendary blowout. After months of deprivation, of trail dust, of bland food and constant danger, the cowboy exploded into town. He was young, he was free, and he was, for a moment, rich. Many would spend this entire stake in a matter of days, or even hours. They would buy new clothes, a fine new hat. They would eat restaurant food until they were sick. And they would head for the saloons and gambling halls. The towns were ready for them, filled with professional gamblers, saloon keepers, and merchants, all eager to separate the cowboy from his wages. After the blowout, the cowboy was faced with a choice. It was autumn. The long drives were over for the season. Many would simply drift south, making their way back to Texas to wait for the spring. These men often became grubbling riders. They were broke, but they could rely on the unwritten code of the West. This code, born of shared hardship, meant that any man riding through could stop at a ranch and be given a hot meal and a bed in the bunkhouse. No questions asked. He might stay a night or a week before riding on to the next ranch. It was a system of mutual aid, a recognition that any cowboy could find himself broke and in need. But some decided to stay. They would winter in the cowtown, and this experience was a stark, jarring contrast to the wild, chaotic summer. The towns themselves, so full of life and violence from May to September, became virtual ghost towns. As the last herds were sold, the cattle buyers left, the gamblers, the soiled doves, and the fair-weather merchants packed up and moved south. The town died. Most of the saloons and dance halls closed their doors, boarding up their windows against the coming cold. The businesses that remained operated with skeleton crews, catering to the few locals. The wide, dusty streets, which had thundered with cattle and echoed with gunshots, were now empty. They filled with mud, which then froze into hard, treacherous ruts, covered in dirty, wind-blown snow. The sound of a single, tinny piano playing in a near-empty saloon to a handful of men was a sad, lonely echo of the summer's frenzy. The air itself changed. The smell of dust and cattle was gone. It was replaced by the heavy, pungent smell of coal and wood smoke, hanging low and still in the cold, frozen air. For the cowboy who stayed, life became a tedious, boring, and often cold existence. He would rent a cheap room in a boarding house, or perhaps a room above one of the few open saloons. He was broke, or nearly broke. He had to find work. These off-season jobs were a far cry from the free life of the range. A cowboy might earn his keep by mucking out the livery stables, or he might be hired for the brutal, cold work of cutting ice. Men would go to the frozen rivers, saw massive blocks of ice from the surface, and haul the heavy, wet chunks to an ice house, where they would be packed in sawdust to last until the next summer. It was miserable, freezing labor. The men who did stay, the merchants and saloon keepers who lived in the town year-round, were sometimes called long. They were the permanent fixtures, the ones who hunkered down and waited, preserving the town's faint pulse until the spring, when the herds and the money would return from the south. For the wintering cowboy, the dominant feeling was one of intense, crushing boredom. This was perhaps the hardest trial. After a life of constant movement, of sleeping under the stars, of new horizons. Every day, he was now confined. He was trapped in a small, cold room, in a small, dead town. The quiet was absolute. There were no gunshots. There was no shouting. There were no thundering herds. There was only the wind, the frozen streets, and the long, slow, agonizing wait for spring. This stillness, this poverty, this profound sense of waiting, was the cowboy's winter. It was this hardship, this other side of the coin, that forged the true legacy of the men who lived this life. And so, we come to a final, quiet reflection, the legacy of the cold. The popular myth of the cowboy is one of sunshine. It is a story of warm deserts, of dusty trails, of bright blue skies. But this is only half the story. The other half, the forgotten half, is written in ice. The legendary toughness of the cowboy was not a romantic choice. It was not a pose. It was a product of brutal, unforgiving necessity. The man who could not endure a night like the one our crew faced, or a winter like the one in a lined shack, simply did not survive. He did not make it as a cowboy. The winter was the great filter of the plains, weeding out the unprepared, the unlucky, and the weak. This life, this constant war with the cold, had long-term consequences. The cowboy's body was a record of his hardships. The repeated freezing and soaking, the years of sleeping on damp ground, the sheer physical toll of the work, it left a mark. Cowboys who survived to old age were often crippled by severe arthritis and rheumatism. Their hands, gnarled and cramped from icy ropes and frozen rains, became permanent claws. They suffered from respiratory issues, from joints that ached with every change in the weather. They paid a heavy physical price for that life of freedom. But this shared hardship also forged a culture, the code of the West, that principle of hospitality, of sharing resources, of helping a stranger. This was not just frontier romanticism. It was a functional, communal survival strategy. You offered a grubline rider a bed because you knew, with absolute certainty, that next winter you could be that man. It was a code born from a shared, fundamental understanding of vulnerability in a brutal environment. We can even see the legacy in the gear. The tools the cowboy developed to survive are still considered masterpieces of function. The wide-brimmed felt hat, so good in the sun, was even better in the winter. Its tight-pressed, water-resistant felt shed snow and deflected wind. The wool shirt, the canvas jacket, these materials, which retain warmth even when damp, are still the gold standard for modern ranchers. The cowboy's gear was not about fashion. It was technology, perfected by the harsh laboratory of the winter plains. The psychological impact was just as deep. This life created a unique character, a sense of fatalism, an acceptance of forces far beyond one's control, a grim, dark sense of humor, which found comedy in misery, and above all, a profound, quiet, uncomplaining resilience. The cowboy did not boast of his toughness. It was simply assumed a prerequisite for existing. This reality stands in stark contrast to the Hollywood myth. The myth prefers the gunshot to the frozen, muddy street. It prefers the dramatic showdown to the slow, quiet endurance of a man in a soddy, listening to the wind. The truth is that this was a human story. It was a story of ordinary, often very young men adapting to an extraordinary and harsh world. The era of the great long drive, the open-range cowboy, was incredibly brief. It was a snapshot in time, lasting little more than 20 years, roughly from 1866 to that catastrophic winter of 1887. but its impact on the world's imagination and on the American character was permanent. The cowboy became and remains a global symbol of independence, of freedom, and of that quiet, stubborn resilience. This constant, quiet war with the winter cold is a part of the cowboy's story that is so often left untold. It shaped the land, the industry, and the very character of the people who lived it. A reality far removed from myth, written in ice and endured in wool and canvas. I hope these reflections have given you a deeper appreciation for their world. As we let these thoughts settle, perhaps you can share a quiet story of resilience from your own family or community, a time when endurance was all that mattered. Let your mind drift on that thought as we find one last corner of this story to explore. And so, we drift into the final, quietest part of our journey. The storm has passed, the morning has come, the great, harsh history of the winter has been told. Now, in the calmest and most peaceful moment, we can simply sit with the past. We can gently turn over the artifacts of this life, the tools that made it possible. This is not a story of action, but of appreciation. It is a slow, soothing look at the simple, functional objects that a cowboy trusted with his life. We begin with the most important of all. It was his throne, his workbench, his chair, and, at the end of a long day, often his pillow. We begin with the saddle. The cowboy's world was one of few possessions. He carried his life in his bedroll, but his saddle was his single most valuable and most personal possession. It was the key to his entire existence. There was an old, grim saying on the plains, "A man afoot is no man at all." Without his horse, he was stranded, but without his saddle, he could not do his job. It was the complex, essential interface between man and animal. It was his anchor in a chaotic world. This icon of the American West, the Western saddle, was not an American invention. Its roots run deep, back to the plains of Spain, and from there to the vaqueros of Mexico. The Spanish riders were masters of cattle, and they developed a saddle for that specific work. The American cowboy, arriving in Texas, adopted this design and adapted it for his own needs. The result was a masterpiece of function. Let us look at it, piece by piece. The first thing you notice, the defining feature, is the horn. To the novice, it looks like a handle, something to grab onto in a moment of panic. But for the working cowboy, this was not its purpose. Grabbing the horn was a sign of a greenhorn. The horn was a tool of leverage. It was designed for dallying. When a cowboy roped a 1,000-pound steer, he did not tie the rope to his saddle. That hard and fast method, used in some parts of Texas, was dangerous. If the steer darted, it could snap the rope, or even pull the horse over. Instead, the cowboy would dally his rope. This meant taking 1 or 2 quick wraps around the horn. The polished, hard horn, combined with the friction of the rope, acted as a powerful, adjustable brake. The cowboy could let the rope slip or hold it tight, controlling the massive animal with subtle pressure, using the horse's weight as an anchor. It was a precise and dangerous art, requiring perfect timing, but the horn made it possible. Then, there is the shape of the seat itself. The front of the saddle, the swell, rose high. The back, the cantle, was also high and steep. This was not for comfort in the way we think of a soft chair. It was for security. This design created a deep, secure bucket for the rider. When a horse stopped on a dime to turn a fast-moving cow, or when it lunged up a steep, rocky incline, the swell and cantle held the cowboy in place. They locked his body to the horse, allowing him to ride with his balance, his legs, and his hips, his hands free for the rope. Underneath, a complex web of straps, the rigging, determined how the saddle sat on the horse's back. Different terrains required different styles. A centerfire rigging, common in some areas, placed the cinch strap directly in the middle, giving the horse more freedom of movement in complex terrain. This rigging was part of the saddle's intricate engineering. The saddle was also his portable workbench. After a long day, a cowboy might sit by the fire, pull his heavy saddle into his lap, and use its solid familiar form as a base to repair his bridle, to sharpen his knife, or to mend a broken piece of gear. Its surfaces were worn smooth in some places and rough in others, and he knew every inch of it by feel. And at night, it found its final use. As we saw with our trail crew, the cowboy would lay his bedroll on the ground. He would then place his saddle at the head of his bed, with the seat facing him. The saddle, with its high cantle, became a perfect, solid windbreak. It shielded his head and shoulders from the constant, cold prairie wind. It was his pillow and his shield. The saddle blanket, the heavy wool pad that went under the saddle to protect the horse's back, was often pulled out and used as an extra insulating layer for the cowboy to sleep on. It might be stiff with dried sweat and horsehair, but it was a precious barrier against the frozen ground. These saddles were expensive. A good, custom-made saddle could cost $50 or more. This was at a time when a cowboy earned perhaps $30 a month. It was an enormous investment. Many men spent more on their saddle than on all their other possessions combined. They were often works of art, the leather stamped with intricate, beautiful tooled patterns of flowers, vines, and leaves. This was not just decoration. It was a profound expression of pride. Each saddle was unique. It was broken in by its owner, its leather molding to the shape of his body, its seat worn smooth by countless hours of riding. The smell of it was a deep, comforting, and complex perfume of oiled leather, horse sweat, and wood smoke. The sound of it, the familiar, rhythmic creak of the leather, and the jingle of the rigging as the horse walked, was the constant soundtrack to the cowboy's life. Lifting it onto the horse's back in the frosty, dark morning, its heavy, solid, reassuring weight was the first step in a long day's work. It was his most prized and most trusted tool. The saddle was his connection to the horse, but his other essential tools were the ones he wore, the ones that protected his body from the harsh world he rode through. We now look at the two most iconic, and perhaps most misunderstood, pieces of cowboy gear, the hat and the boots. They are, in the modern world, symbols of a style, a fashion. But in the 19th century, they were pure, functional technology. They were tools, as essential as the rope or the saddle. Let's start with the hat. The original cowboy hat was not the one we see in most movies. It was a design called the Boss of the Plains, and it was invented by a man named John B. Stetson in 1865. Stetson created a hat designed specifically for the needs of the men in the West. It was made of high-quality beaver felt. This was the key. Beaver felt is not like the cloth in a modern hat. It is a dense, matted, incredibly durable material that is naturally and almost completely waterproof. The tight-pressed fibers would shed rain and snow all day long. The Boss of the Plains had a very wide brim, about 4 inches. This was its primary function. It was a portable piece of shade, a shield against the relentless, blinding sun of the plains. In a rainstorm, it was an umbrella, channeling water away from the man's face and neck, down the back of his slicker. In a snowstorm, it kept the driving wet snow from his eyes. A cowboy, caught in a blizzard, would pull his brim down low, tuck his chin, and let the hat take the brunt of the storm. The top of the hat, the crown, was also functional. It was tall and originally completely uncreased, with a soft, open, rounded top. This high crown provided a large, insulating pocket of air above the man's head, keeping him warm in the cold, and surprisingly cooler in the heat. Cowboys, over time, began to crease the crowns themselves. A punch in the center, a long trough, or 2 pinches on the side. These creases were a man's personal signature, but they also helped channel rainwater off the hat. Like all his gear, the hat was a multi-purpose tool. It was not treated with care, it was used. If a fire was smoldering, a cowboy would take off his hat and fan the flames, the wide brim creating a powerful gust of air. If he needed to water his horse from a stream his horse could not reach, he would use his waterproof hat as a temporary bucket, scooping water and letting his horse drink. He might even use it as a quirt or a short whip to urge his horse forward. The smell of a wet beaver felt hat drying by a fire, a faint, earthy animal scent, was a common one in every camp. The hat was his shield from the world above. His boots were his connection to the stirrup, and, like the hat, they were a specific, functional design. The cowboy boot, as we know it, has several key features. The first is the high, underslung heel, which angles forward. This was not for style, and it was not for walking. That high, angled heel was a safety device. Its primary purpose was to keep a rider's foot from slipping through the stirrup. If a man fell from his horse, the worst possible outcome was to have his foot caught in the stirrup. He would be dragged to his death. The high, angled heel made this almost impossible. It would catch on the stirrup, allowing the man to fall free. The second feature was the pointed toe. This was not as extreme as the points we see in many modern, fashionable boots, but it was tapered. This, too, was a functional design. A cowboy, often mounting his horse in the pre-dawn darkness, could not see his stirrup. The pointed toe made it easier to find the stirrup by feel, guiding his foot into it quickly and surely. The third feature was what the boot lacked: a flat, grippy sole. The sole of a cowboy boot was slick, made of smooth leather. This was also a safety feature. If the rider did fall, the slick sole would allow his foot to slide out of the stirrup more easily. This collection of features made the boot the perfect riding tool, but it also made it a terrible walking tool. The high heel and slick sole made walking long distances painful, awkward, and difficult. The clack, clack of the boot heels on a wooden boardwalk was a familiar sound in any cowtown, but it was the sound of a man who was profoundly off balance. The cowboy boot was not made for walking. It was made for riding. To protect his legs, the cowboy wore chaps, which were leather leggings worn over his pants. These were not, primarily, for warmth. They were a protective armor against the thorny brush of the plains, like mesquite, which could tear a man's pants and legs to ribbons. In the winter, however, special Angora chaps, lined with woolly goatskin, were worn for their incredible warmth. And finally, around his neck, he wore the bandana, or neckerchief, often made of silk, a surprisingly durable and absorbent material. This was his personal dust filter. When riding drag at the back of the herd, enveloped in a choking cloud of dust, the cowboy would pull his bandana up over his nose and mouth, a simple, effective filter that made it possible to breathe. In the cold, it was one more layer to protect his neck from the wind. These simple tools, the hat, the boots, the chaps, the bandana, they were his personal, wearable kit, his first line of defense against the elements. These tools were for the man, his saddle was for the horse, but there was one final, essential tool that was for the whole crew. It was the mobile, beating heart of the trail drive. It was the chuck wagon. The chuck wagon was the camp's center. It was the kitchen, the pantry, the supply shed, and the social hub. It was the first thing the cowboys looked for at the end of a long, grueling day on the trail. Its arrival, and the sight of a small fire being lit next to it, meant that rest and food were near. This ingenious rolling kitchen was invented by a man named Charles Goodnight, one of the most famous of all the Texas cattlemen. In the mid-1860s, he took a sturdy, surplus army wagon and heavily modified it. His most brilliant addition was the chuck box. This was a large, wooden pantry, a complex system of small drawers, shelves, and compartments, that was bolted to the back of the wagon. Each little space was designed to hold something specific: tin plates, a bag of flour, salt, spices, cutlery, and medicine. The front of this chuck box was a large, hinged boot, or lid. When the wagon was stopped for the night, this lid would be folded down, supported by a swinging leg, and it would become the cookie's work table. This was his kitchen counter, where he would chop meat, mix dough, and prepare the entire meal. The chuck wagon carried everything. Hung underneath it was a caboose, a rawhide sling that carried firewood or cow chips. Strapped to the sides were large water barrels, axes, shovels, and often a cask of sourdough starter. And piled inside the wagon itself, on top of the 100-pound bags of beans and flour, were all the cowboys' bedrolls. The wagon was their mobile home. The man who ran this domain was the cookie. He was often the second highest paid man on the drive, right after the trail boss. He was frequently one of the oldest and grumpiest members of the crew. His temper was legendary, and his authority was absolute. The unwritten, sacred rule of the camp was simple: you never, ever tie your horse to the chuck wagon. The wagon was Cookie's sacred territory, and to risk pulling it over was a cardinal sin. Cookie's most important tool was the Dutch oven. This was not a kitchen appliance. It was a heavy, indestructible, cast-iron pot with a flat, flanged lid. This pot was the key to civilization on the trail. With it, Cookie could do anything. He could fry bacon, stew meat, or boil beans. But its greatest trick was baking. To make the trail's staple bread, biscuits, Cookie would mix his sourdough or baking powder dough and place it in the greased oven. He would then nestle the heavy pot in the hot coals of the fire. But he would also use his shovel to scoop more hot coals and pile them on top of the flat, flanged lid. The cast iron would heat evenly, and the biscuits would bake perfectly from both above and below. The smell of those fresh, hot sourdough biscuits baking in the open air was a warm, comforting, and wonderful aroma that meant the day's work was truly done. The menu was simple, dictated by what could be carried. It was known as the 3 B's: beans, bacon, and biscuits. The bacon was a heavily cured salt pork, often called sowbelly, which was fried in a giant skillet. The beans were pinto beans, boiled for hours. And the biscuits, of course, came from the Dutch oven. And then there was the coffee. It was the fuel of the trail drive. The most popular brand was Arbuckles, which came as whole beans. In each 1-pound bag of Arbuckles, there was a single peppermint stick. This was a small, welcome treat. The coffee was Pecos style. It was made by boiling the grounds, not filtering them. The result was a bitter, strong, bracing, and powerful brew. The coffee pot was always on, 24 hours a day. It sat on the coals, bubbling, all night long. When a night guard, cold and tired from his 2-hour watch, rode into the dim light of the camp, his first stop was the chuck wagon. He would pour a tin cup of the scalding black coffee, its bitter, strong aroma cutting through the cold, and it would be the first taste of warmth and rest. The sound of Cookie, long before dawn, banging his pots and pans against the side of the wagon, was the crew's alarm clock. The wagon, the coffee, the smell of frying bacon, ... This was the heart of their world. The wagon, the saddle, the hat, the wool. These simple pieces come together to paint a full, gentle, and complete picture of this life. And now, our own journey through this world, from the raging storm to this quiet, reflective catalog, is coming to its end. The story of the cowboy, we have learned, is a story of adaptation. It is a story of human beings finding a way to survive and even thrive in a harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving world. The winter was the truest test of that adaptation. We have moved past the bright, simple sunshine of the Hollywood myth to understand the sensory reality of this life. We know now that the key elements were simple, elemental things: wool, canvas, leather, and fire, and the human elements were simpler, still: endurance, community, and resilience. We can acknowledge the deep, profound harshness of that life, while also finding a deep, quiet peace in the story. It was a brief moment in time, that transition from the 19th century trail to the 20th century ranch, but the cowboy, as a figure of quiet strength and independence, remains a permanent, gentle part of our cultural imagination. The prairie is quiet now. The cattle are sleeping, huddled together for warmth. And now, the last embers of our campfire have faded to a soft, warm glow. The prairie is still, the herd is quiet, and the story of that long, cold night is at its end. We've felt the bite of the blue norther, the scratch of the wool, and the profound relief of the morning sun. The cowboy's world, so often seen through a lens of romance, was one of deep, human endurance. I hope this journey into the past has brought you a sense of calm, comfort, and peace. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on Sleeping Scribe. Your listenership and support mean the world to us. If you've enjoyed our story, we'd be so grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the channel, or perhaps sharing it with someone else you think might enjoy a peaceful story. We hope you're feeling relaxed and ready for rest until our next journey. Sleep well and good night.